My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, literary blogger and now novelist Mark Sarvas. Plus, as always, what are you reading? The Marketplace of Ideas is a show about books, commerce, culture, and fascinating concepts. We'll be covering all that ground every week. You can catch the show on KCSB 91.9 in Santa Barbara. The terrestrial broadcast goes on Saturday mornings. Check www.kcsb.org for their programming schedules, or get it on the podcast. Check out our website, www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. You'll find all the info there.
God bless the child that could write his own rhyme.
So what are you reading? This is a regular segment on the Marketplace of Ideas where we find out from audience members, what are they reading? What do they want others to read? What should people just read in general? What's the essential canon of the listening audience? Let us know. Give us a call on the Marketplace of Ideas hotline. That is 805-585-3947. One more time, 805-585-3947. Leave a concise, preferably witty message telling us what's good about the book you're suggesting. Once again, that number is 805-585-3947. It's the Marketplace of Ideas listener hotline. You could be featured on the next show.
It's wondered by many, understood by few.
My guest is Mark Sarvas, author of The Elegant Variation, a very popular literary blog and a widely published critic. You've probably seen his work in the New York Times Book Review, among other places. He's got a novel hitting the shelves in May called Harry Revised. Mark, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks for inviting me.
So, let's go way back when, to 2003. What brought you to the point where you said to yourself, well, it's time to start a literary blog?
Well, I, like many others at that time, had stumbled on to the existing world of blogs, which was perhaps no longer quite in its infancy, but still fairly early on. And there were a handful of blogs that I became a regular reader of and a fan of, Maud Newton's blog, The Literary Saloon, Moorish Girl, sort of chief among them. And I was reading them every day, and I found that there was something that I thought I had to contribute to the conversation. Part of it was very sort of simply geographical. I lived in Los Angeles. There was a burgeoning L.A. literary scene, and I wanted to maybe shine a little bit more of a local spotlight. Most of the other literary blogs were very New York-centric, East Coast-based, and I thought, okay, there's a little niche that I could potentially fill. And I had a slightly different sensibility from those blogs that was up there. And I had perhaps I've been accused of being a little pugnacious sometimes, a little controversial, but I thought that I offered a different perspective. And finally, I am a child of European immigrants, so a lot of my early reading, my upbringing, sort of earthed in European literature, and that was also a perspective that I thought I could bring that was a little different, that wasn't being talked about as regularly outside of the literary saloon, which really does make its business to focus on international literature and translation. So all these things came together, and frankly, launching a blog was so shockingly easy. I'm within an hour on TypePad, which is a wonderful service, easy to use. I had The Elegant Variation up and running, and I dare say it was up before I'd put a lot of thought into really how I intended to fill it.
So you just jumped into the water?
Yes.
The blogging water?
Yes.
So what The Elegant Variation brings to the table, it's a European and an LA sensibility?
Well, that's certainly how it started. I'm not sure I can guarantee that I've been absolutely consistent in all those things. There are times where I perhaps pay a little less attention to what's going on in my backyard than I should.
No.
There are other times, I had an opportunity last year to go to New York and file coverage of the Penn World Voices panels, which occurred at the same weekend as the Los Angeles Times Book Festival. So that was a case where I made a decision to forsake my home and
Oh,
and go
betrayal,
elsewhere.
betrayal.
Exactly, but the lineup at Penn World Voices was kind of hard to resist.
Did you get a lot of emails about that?
People actually loved the coverage because what the other side of that is that people who do live here in LA were able to go to the LA Times Book Festival for themselves and didn't necessarily need me to write about it, but they didn't have the opportunity to see these panels in New York, and so I was bringing them something new, and they were very pleased with that.
So since you've seen both the coast's literary scenes here in America, let's talk about the LA literary scene. What distinguishes it, other than geography, from, say, New York or even Chicago?
Well, the biggest thing, I think, has to be there's a level of congeniality here. It's a kinder, gentler literary scene. I would find the New York scene a bit too sharp-elbowed for my tastes, and I'm a sharp-elbowed kind of guy. But there's a less competitive, kinder, when I run into other writers in Los Angeles, it's not typically, the discussions aren't about which book launch they recently attended or which book launch they're irritated because they hadn't been invited to. It's about the work.
So, Los Angeles literary scene a little bit friendlier. You're saying there's friends in the LA scene where there aren't so many in other places?
Exactly. I would perhaps, look, this may be my own paranoia speaking. I would find myself much more guarded in New York than I do among LA. The other thing, and I had this experience when I was recently in New York, and I had the good fortune I was invited to participate in this panel at Columbia University on the case of the Vanishing Book Review.
Oh, yes, I heard that podcast.
Oh, which was a great evening. I really enjoyed it, and afterwards we went out for dinner, and I had a dinner with the panelists, and it was a wonderful evening, and I was remarking to my wife afterwards that those kind of get-togethers, one, on the other hand, doesn't always have in Los Angeles, and to be sitting at a table with, the likes of Steve Wasserman, Elizabeth Sifton, Carlin Romano, there's some real intellectual firepower there. But I said, if I lived in New York, I think the thing that would plague me every night would be wondering where these dinners were occurring that I hadn't been invited to. There's something insidious about that, and I think it's what I find from the writers in L.A. is they're productive because they're, everything's so far away anyway. It is a terrible cliche, but it's true. You have to get in your car to go off and see people. So you spend time down in your study, in your office, at home, focused and getting your writing done. And we seem like a productive lot, and I think that makes us happier when we're productive. So.
Since you brought up the crisis in book reviewing and Steve Wasserman and his long article, but enjoyable article in the Columbia Journalism Review and the panel, I guess I'll ask you, do you think there is a crisis?
In fact, I do not. And this is something, that Steve and I have discussed, and I've actually discussed with some members of the National Book Critics Circle, of which I'm a member. Or rather, I think that I think the calls of crisis are overblown, and I think that what people are identifying as the crisis is a mistake, and there's a mistaken focus there. I think that we're living in an age that is in a much broader crisis of cultural literacy, and I think that is the kind of thing that is trickling down, and it's affecting book reviews. But you're seeing classical music reviews being cut. You're seeing formerly sacrosanct film reviews being cut. So the way our culture approaches serious reading has changed, along with the way it approaches many other serious art forms. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about a crisis in book reviewing. I also think that although the world of print journalism as we know it is changing, there are opportunities that are opening. And one of my criticisms of the NBCC is the amount of energy that's sort of been devoted going after places like the San Diego Tribune, the Atlanta Constitution, places that have made decisions to roll back their book coverage. And all this energy is going after them as though they can somehow be persuaded to change their minds. And my reading of the business landscape is, newspapers are businesses. They're not necessarily going to be receptive to that argument. What I am more interested in are the outlets that are looking to innovate, that are looking to use the technology, that are looking to use the Internet, which I think has come along and provides a remarkable opportunity at the moment that print column inches are diminishing. I just got invited by Steve Wasserman to contribute a book review for his new book section in Truth Dig. I had an opportunity, what began as an 800-word review, ended as a nearly 1,700-word review, and it's going to run entirely on the Internet, online, and it'll be available to all these readers. And Steve had a flexibility to be able to tell me, here's the assignment, but if you think there's more to say or you think there's something here, you can go longer. And he and I discussed it, and we found that there was, in fact, more to say. And I don't see that kind of opportunity regularly occurring at newspapers. It may occur, for the creme de la creme of reviewers, but for the working, book reviewer on the street like myself, that's not an opportunity that normally gets extended.
So you have a foot in the internet book culture and the newsprint book culture, and what I'm hearing from you is that the internet is where it's going.
I do believe so. And as if you listen to the podcast of the Columbia Journalism panel, I said there, and I'll say it again, I'm not some glassy-eyed proselytizer of the internet saying technology will save us and e-books are the future.
So you're not Wired magazine, essentially?
No, not by a long shot, but I am a realist. And the realist in me says that the generation that is completely comfortable getting their news online is already walking among us. They're college students today. They're the future, protectors of the literary flame. They're out there. This is the way we need to get a hold of them. And I would love to see organizations like the NBCC apply their creativity to seeking out and even creating new opportunities in that online literary marketplace, as opposed to kind of spinning our wheels in what I do think is a dying paradigm.
What do you think of the state of the LA Times book review right now?
The LA Times book review.
Yes.
Well, I think that they are trying their hardest with a crummy hand that they have been dealt. I think that the decision to, as I'm sure you're aware, I don't know if all your listeners are aware, several months ago, the book review, the page count was essentially halved, and the book review was grafted onto the opinion section. So you read the book review, and then you go halfway into the section, then you flip it over upside down, and then you've got the opinion section.
I admit to being pained by that.
Yes, we all were. And there was a commitment made at that time that they would explore new synergies, and people do love that word, with the web, that they would really integrate the book review, and I was very heartened at that prospect, as I was disappointed with the results. I think part of it has to do perhaps with institutional pressures that I'm not really privy to. I know David Hewlin. He's a smart, good critic. I give him the benefit of the doubt, and I give him credit. So I have to assume that if there are things he's not doing, it's not necessarily that he hasn't thought of them. It's just that he is unable to do them. But I don't see a lot of vision in the web component of the book review. I come back and I talk about The Guardian often. I mean, The Guardian is a web presence that has millions of international readers.
Oh, and yes.
It has them because it's made itself an essential resource by being that good.
You see the LA Times internet presence, at least for the book review, is kind of perfunctory then. Sort of, it's there, that's
Absolutely.
Good enough.
Absolutely, and it's sort of little more than the online version of what is available in print. They've added one or two additional columns and an internal blog called Jacket Copy that is sometimes interesting and sometimes not. But my one sort of criticism with overarching criticism with the book review is that there's just purely at the sentence level, there's still too much bad writing that gets into each issue, and it really surprises me.
Why do you think that the bad writing gets in, considering how little space they have? And I know, most of it's becoming pictures now, but regardless, the little space they have for text, why do you think that so many substandard reviews get in there?
It's hard to speculate. There are probably a couple of reasons. One is that, as I'm learning myself, writing a review becomes an inherently trickier business the more time you spend in this business, because you do begin to know people. You do begin to consider your own future. One is reluctant to just open both barrels and come out blasting. And so sometimes I think perhaps one can twist themselves into knots looking for that positive thing to try to say, to balance the review, to make it not. But beyond that, I think some of the people on the LA Times Book Review have probably been there for a long time. They're probably doing it for quite a while. And sometimes I get the sense that it's being phoned in. They're you'd have to look back through the archives of Fishbowl LA, which is a Los Angeles-based media blog.
Mm-hmm.
But they pointed out a sentence in I think it was this Sunday, September 30th issue of the blog. Of the book review, that barely constituted an English language sentence. And I was sort of...
I remember that.
Yeah, and I was aghast when I read it myself, but I was doing my panel at the West Hollywood Book Festival that day, and so I wasn't really in a position to weigh in on it. But that sort of thing, when I see that, I have to ask myself, who's minding the store?
That's a good question. Speaking of newspaper book reviews and the major ones, you do a lot less New York Times book review bashing than other blogs, and that doesn't seem like it's just because you've written for them. You seem to genuinely like it more than most bloggers do.
Absolutely, very, very, very much the case. And I was a proponent of the New York Times long before they ever signed me to anything. Which doesn't mean I haven't criticized them. One of the earliest sort of signal moments in my blog was when I posted an open letter to Sam Tannenhouse. Because I was irritated about something he did, and I sort of called him on it and run a list of titles of newly issued fiction titles that he might have reviewed in place of what he had done. And to his great credit, he came into the comments box and he replied. And for anyone who's ever spent any time in the comments box of some of the bigger blogs, that can be a bruising and a bare-knuckling experience, and it takes some courage to do that. And Sam really sort of took on the criticism, took on the question, and in our emails, subsequently, he's told me he doesn't mind being criticized. What I think bothers them, understandably, is just what they perceive as sort of ad hominem, just sort of the constant rudeness that doesn't seek to be constructive in any way. My position has always been, or I always try to make it, that you can disagree with someone in a way that doesn't have to result purely in name-calling. And in fact, you accomplish more if you can engage someone who you disagree with in a dialogue. That said, I think the New York Times, by virtue of its visibility and its role in the publishing world, becomes a whipping boy. It's, invariably, when you're the new kid at school and you want to make your name, you go up and you pick a fight with the biggest kid in school. That's what you do. That's how you get your reputation. And I think there's a lot of that out there. I personally think the New York Times is almost uniformly, it's well written, it's interesting. They feel obligated to cover certain kinds of books, and I understand that. But I also see them struggling to go farther afield. And when I do see them online, I see them with a much more vital web presence. So there are. It doesn't mean that I don't disagree with them. I certainly do. They would be a not remotely interesting book review if I didn't disagree with them at some time.
Is the New York Times Book Review your favorite current book reviewing publication, or is there another?
Well, if you're talking about newspaper book reviews, and there are only a handful of...
Let's broaden it to any...
And to anyone, no. I would say that's not the case. My personal favorite book review publication is the New York Review of Books. With the caveat that it always disappoints me that they don't cover more fiction.
Oh.
And I am, my interest is fiction, literary fiction. I focus on novels, and it bothers me that in the main, you're lucky to get one or two novels per issue. That said, the level of writing is just something that really cannot be touched in this country. I think right behind it, and really a wonderful upstart, as Steve Wasserman called them, is book form. And book form is quite excellent. And I also am a subscriber, a regular reader of Times Literary Supplement and London Review of Books out of the UK, both of which are also really excellent book reviews.
I was going to ask you about book form because I just subscribed myself. I couldn't put it off anymore. $24 for 2 years. What is it? It's very cheap, and the content is always excellent on the web.
It's wonderful, and they've made a shrewd business decision. These are... I see book form looking to the future because they've essentially made the entire issue available online.
Yeah.
And certainly there are questions. Well, then what compels one to subscribe? Why would anyone buy the magazine? But I think you find people like yourself who go on the web, they see what's on there, they're impressed by that, and you feel like that's a magazine I'd like to have come into my home. And it's actually a handsomely designed magazine. It's really well put together. It's a pleasure to read. So
yeah, some say they're giving away the store online, but I look at it online and it's like flipping through it at the Borders or whatever. It makes me want to get the genuine article.
Exactly, and I think I think that as people begin to understand that, that's the internet model we're moving to. I'm always frustrated with magazines that I love that lock up so much of their content online, and I wish they would put more of it, make more of it.
Times Literary Supplement. Are you listening?
Yes, TLS, London Review of Books. I mean, because of my subscriber status, I get to get into their archives in both of those cases, but I think they're cheating themselves of a wider readership by doing that.
Who is your favorite working critic? And I think I may know the answer, but who is it?
I think you may know it, too, if you spend any time on my blog.
Oh, I do.
So, it is James Wood,
Yes.
which will surprise nobody who's ever spent more than 10 minutes at my
Another
blog.
correct guess for me. James Wood. All right, so what about James Wood's criticism brings you back every time?
There's so much, and one has to be cautious because one doesn't want to end up sounding like a completely geeky fanboy. is a risk when I speak about Wood. But the best thing I can say about Wood is that invariably when I read his criticism, particularly of a book that I've already read, I feel like he read a completely different book, and it makes me want to go back and to reread the book. He's a wonderfully elegant writer. Just purely at the sentence level, I derive great pleasure from reading what he writes. But what is more compelling for me about Wood as a critic is the way he thinks and the way he reads a book. I find his close readings of text something that is worth emulating, not just as a fledgling critic myself, but even as a reader. When I look at the way Wood sort of peers beneath the hood of a novel and pokes at its workings, I'm invariably impressed and sometimes awestruck. His review of the Philip Roth novel Exit Ghost, which just ran in the New Yorker. I've read most of the coverage around of this book, and that's always an illuminating experience where there's a book that's been out for a while. A number of big critics have tackled it, taken it on, some better than others, and then Wood weighs in. Mm-hmm. And there is an order of magnitude that separates the thoughtfulness of his coverage from everything else in the field. Now, to be fair to all those other working critics, he has more time, he has more space, he has certain luxuries that they don't have. But Edmund Wilson is a critic that is much on everybody's lips these days now that the Library of America has reissued 2 volumes of his criticism.
Well, that's right.
And Wood really is, I think, our Wilson. Cynthia Ozick called him, I think, our greatest critic, and basically called for having him cloned. I paraphrase her, but that we needed many more of him. But he's a remarkable. I wholly recommend to anyone who's interested in literature and serious reading, both of his essay collections, The Broken Estate and The Irresponsible Self.
I love James Wood as well, and tell me if I'm far off the mark in this, but I like that he isn't an academic, and at last I heard he wasn't an academic. Am I still correct there?
You are very much correct.
Okay, and he brings something. Would you agree?
I do entirely. He wrote a review for the London Review of Books a couple of years ago. It was one of the Oxford anthologies, and I forget which one. But he spoke about, one of the things he lamented was the disappearance of what he called the literary amateur. And in his coinage, an amateur was not a pejorative. It was the idea that there was a time, there was an age where forgive the sexist construction, but men of letters, people who took an abiding interest in literature, but did it without sort of the jargon, the cant of the academy, who were interested in books. And one of the points that he makes that's really wonderful is that you go into a classroom today where theory is taught and all these high-flown notions of literary criticism, and the question that's never asked is it any good?
Yes.
Did you like it? Because that's a question that has fallen into discredit among academics, but is something that any writer speaking to another writer, it's the first thing.
In the academy, you're looked down on if you ask if a book is good. It's
absolutely.
You get laughed off the playground. It's
absolutely
terrible.
And Wood's point is how much is lost by doing that. So yes, I think he's a great answer to the current schools of academic criticism, which hold very little allure for me, but.
Me either. So I was going to ask you what you think the elements of effective criticism are, but I'm getting the feeling it's just kind of what you just said, what James Wood does.
It's what he does, and he has one other, remarkable benefit, which is he brings such a depth
Yes.
of reading to his work. I'm sitting in my home office here, and I'm looking at a shelf, and it's a shelf on one of my bookcases that it's the James Wood shelf, and it's simply filled with books that are the books that he has championed, the writers that I know are particularly dear to him. I've got things like Zeno's Conscience by Italo Svevo. I've got Naipaul's The House for Mr. Biswas. There's Virginia Woolf, of course. We've got Henry Green, who I was unfamiliar with before Wood wrote about him. His beloved Saul Bellow. We've got Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. I mean, this is a guy who sort of brings the history of literature under his belt with him to every conversation, and that's a remarkable. I think you have to have that to be a critic of any weight.
So Wood is taking the number one spot in your mind. Is there a close runner-up, or at all close? There's probably not a close runner-up, but is there?
There are several who I think are truly excellent. I mean, I think Daniel Mendelsohn, who reviews often for the New York Review of Books, and wrote a wonderful memoir called The Lost, is truly an excellent critic. I think Louis Menand is also a terrific critic. There's a group of critics that whenever I see their name, I'm always certain to read what they have to say. Frank Kermode from the UK. There are, who else do I? There's a few. There's a reviewer actually working for the London Review of Books. Adam Phillips, I believe, is his name. Extraordinarily smart, really, really terrific. And then there are guys like John Updike, who we all must continue to read. And I think whatever you think of him or his criticism, that there are certain critics of the day with whom we have to engage, and he's one. And I continue to find Christopher Hitchens' criticism weirdly entertaining, despite the fact that he sort of has lost his mind post September 11th.
Oh, I see.
But when he separates his reactionary politics and just starts talking about literature, he's still a very gifted critic as well. Martin Amis, I have a copy of The War Against Cliché that it sits very lovingly on my shelf, as I've always felt he's a superior critic to a novelist.
You do seem to have a little bit of I don't want to say ambivalent, but an on-again, off-again appreciation of Amis. Is that correct?
Yes, that is. I mean, to me, he's definitely, I think his work as a critic is superior to his work as a novelist. And I find his work as a novelist uneven and not always to my taste. He's a bit chilly for me and a bit clever. And although, ironically, I liked House of Meetings much, much more than his latest book than many others seem to. I thought it was more the sort of thing I would like to see from him, certainly than Yellow Dog, which was all but unreadable. One has to side with Tibor Fischer on that one, regardless of how intemperate his criticism was. So.
The consensus on House of Meetings, actually not consensus, but a little bit of a trend that there's been in criticism, is that Amos has finally gotten it. Is that something you agree with?
Well, I think to answer that, one would have to see how it sustains over more than merely one novel.
No.
I think what I found with House of Meetings was, again, that less chilly, less. One can't really say less cerebral with Martin Amis because he is nothing if not cerebral. But there is I was in one of my outings with Los Angeles writers the other night. We were talking about sort of the problem of cleverness. There are writers out there whom one can categorize as clever, and for me, I don't consider clever to be a good thing.
Oh, I see.
To me, when my novel comes out, if people call it clever, I will probably be put out or a little bit insulted because there's a glibness I find to being clever. Cleverness generally, for me, seems to mask other shortcomings. And I've found Amos to be a very clever writer, but not a particularly humane writer.
So you think of clever in the too clever by half sense.
Exactly. And I think House of Meetings is an unexpectedly humane book from Amos. So if he continues in that vein, then I would side with those who you identify as saying that Amos may in fact have finally gotten it. So.
For those just tuning in, my guest is Mark Sarvas, author of The Elegant Variation, a popular literary blog, perhaps the LA literary blog, and a novelist as well of the upcoming Harry Revised. I wanted to ask you as well about, we've talked about one strain of criticism, one strain of book reviewing, the kind you like, but there's another one that It seems there's no love lost between you and it, and I'm talking about the McSweeney's Believer sort of aesthetic. Is that the correct image I've got?
Not entirely. Somewhat, but not entirely. I certainly, in the earlier days of my blog, I was perhaps a bit more hostile to the McSweeney's enterprise.
No.
And I'll say that, you know, as an ethos, you know, sort of, if there's such a thing as a McSweeney's worldview, that's something I'm not particularly congenial to, only because there's a sort of a twee sensibility. You know, if Martin Amis is too clever by half, and the McSweeney's gang can at times be too precious by half.
Oh, I see.
And it's just not always terribly interesting to me. But I don't want to throw such an all-encompassing blanket over them, because there are remarkable writers who I've written about on my website, ranging from Salvador Plasencia, who wrote the wonderful People of Paper, to Chris Adrian, The Children's Hospital. I mean, there's really remarkable work that comes out of the McSweeney's enterprise. Lawrence Weschler's wonderful volume, Everything That Rises. He's a magnificent writer and thinker, and in fact, although I know this will be broadcast on a delay, he is appearing this evening in Los Angeles at the Hammer Museum, and I will probably be making the rare in-person trip to trek out and see him, because he's worth listening to.
No.
And he's very much part of that universe. The sort of tangent there is the magazine The Believer and their critical ethos. And Heidi Julavitz appeared at a panel at Book Expo and rather famously or infamously now said 850-word reviews are bullshit. and I think she overstates that somewhat. I think the 850-word review can serve a purpose, and in the right hands, the right practitioner, they can be valuable. I'll say there are not many people who do it well, but those who do, they are worth reading. Where I differ with The Believer is in this notion that we oughtn't say negative things about books. You know, we should all love each other. We should all be very, you know, it's a bit of a round of kumbaya for all.
If it's a book, it's good?
No, I think it's more, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything.
I see.
And I don't agree with that. I side more with Clive James, who wrote famously in the New York Times op-ed page some years ago about the value of snark, and the bad book review has an important place in the literary ecosystem. And look, I'm speaking as someone who potentially faces receiving them 6 or 7 months from now, and I certainly don't want to, and I don't welcome them. But there is a difference between the sort of book review that's merely, you know, ill-informed name-calling, or versus, again, perhaps the kind of negative book review that James Wood will write, where it's not a question of the writer or their personality. It's really looking at the failure of the book's, you know, artistic mission. That here's something, it didn't come off, and here's why. You know, if you're willing to believe that all books are written in good faith, that you know, all but the most cynical of authors, when they sit down, really have something that they passionately believe in, they're trying to get out there, they're trying to get said, you do that book, I think, a discredit if you do anything other than engaging with it honestly. And sometimes engaging with it honestly will be to say something negative about it.
So a negative James Wood review is something substantial, whereas a negative Dale Peck review, not quite the same thing?
Is name calling. Yeah, and that's the problem. You know, there's not, you know, Dale Peck's a little bit yesterday's story from the perspective that he doesn't really review much anymore.
Yeah.
And he's even, you know, to his credit, seems to have renounced his former ways. But his reviews drip with such scathing, such venom, and such anger, sort of directed as the writer, as personality, that I don't think you get the same value. You know, you can read James Wood's review of Underworld very famously. This is a book that clearly, you know, on some level he admires and respects the art, and he sees what DeLillo is capable of, he sees what he's all about, but the book doesn't quite work for him. And that is a real serious engagement with the material that I think any author would welcome, that kind of engagement with their work, even if it's one that says, I don't think that this works.
So you would welcome, let's say, I don't know what would lead to this series of events, but let's say that you one day woke up to a negative Harry Revised review from James Wood, you would be happy.
Well,
in a way.
in a way, let's say that is way down on the list of things I'm hoping for. but I know that if Wood were to review it and were to review it negatively, I would learn something from his review.
You know your next book would be better if he did that.
And yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think that writers when they reach a certain point in their career become perhaps less open to that kind of give and take. I hear often writers saying, "Well, I've never learned anything from a critic. I've never learned anything from a reviewer," and that's okay. That's interesting, and perhaps I'll feel that way down the line. But I would have to think that if James Woods were to spend 2,500 words telling me where I'd gotten it wrong with Harry Revised, I'm pretty sure I would learn something from that.
I'd like to get your impressions on a few literary people and their work. These don't have to be evaluations, don't need to be dishing dirt, just your thoughts. So, person number one, Ian McEwan.
I think Ian McEwan is a magnificent novelist. He is one of those writers of whom I think the world. That said, I did agree with the critics of Saturday, which I felt was a less than effort. But I thought Atonement was really a remarkable piece of work, and I was equally moved and impressed with his latest on Chesil Beach. I mean, there are a handful of writers who, when their galleys, when their books, when things come across my desk, I drop everything and pick them up. Peter Carey's new book showed up the other day. He's one of them. Ian McEwan is another one. So
you are not among the Ian McEwan detractors, of which there are increasingly many, I find.
Yes, and I don't understand that, and I think that some of that is, again, there's an unfortunate tendency in the literary world that when one has it too good for too long, corrections will set in. And I think there perhaps is some of that, but I think it's largely wrong-headed, and I do think that McEwan is one of the great novelists of his age, frankly.
He's gotten too big, got to take him down, says that mentality.
It's that bully in the classroom thing again, you know?
Person number two, Sir Tom Stoppard.
Oh, I'm a great admirer of Stoppard. I actually wrote a review for the Threepenny Review in the current issue on his first and only novel, Lord Malquist and Mr. Moon.
I was just reading that the other day.
His novel or my review?
I was reading the novel. I haven't read any reviews of the novel, but I'll check out yours as soon as I finish it. Not before, but as soon.
And this is one that unfortunately you won't be able to find online. You'll have to actually buy a copy of the Threepenny Review. But he's a marvelous playwright. I think that he's another one who fits that McEwan category of whatever he does, I drop everything and go. I'm actually planning to hop back to New York for a weekend to see Rock and Roll, which I've read and actually was not absolutely blown away by it. That was one of the times with Stoppard where I read it and I thought, well, okay, I'm not sure this one really does it for me. But Arcadia, Invention of Love, I think these are absolute masterpieces. And he is someone, again, whose work will always be interesting to me.
I should probably, by way of disclosure, say that I'm a hopeless Stoppard addict, and it's I'll never get all the fix that I need of Stoppard, but I'm glad to hear you like him too.
I actually flew to London to see the original Coast of Utopia. I wanted to see it at the National Theatre,
nice.
And I saw it. I think I saw the first play one night, and then I sat through the other two sort of back to back, and just completely lost myself in it and in the production, and it was an incredibly memorable theatrical experience.
What I wouldn't give for that. Just what would you say Tom Stoppard has? What he brings something to the table no one else does. What do you call it?
Formidable curiosity.
Ah, yes.
I just, what I love is that I can never predict from one Stoppard play to the next what his, obsession du jour will be. Whether it'll be chaos theory, it'll be quantum physics. It's going to be something that is going to be tremendously interesting and will be meaningfully explored. He doesn't use these things merely as a gimmick, as a framing device. He actually, again, chaos theory and its use in Arcadia. Arcadia is a breathtaking piece of work.
Mm-hmm.
And he does that remarkably well in a way that I think nobody else does. And he is appropriately theatrical with a capital T, which I think too much theater today perhaps is missing.
Arcadia was actually one of the first plays I ever saw when I think I was like 10. And, oh man, that life-changing.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Person number 4. Actually, we're only up to 3.
Number 3, yeah.
I skipping ahead. Okay. Person number 3, and I don't know if you're going to remember who this is, but Marisha Pessl.
Oh, of course. I don't have a deep, strong opinion about Marisha Pessl one way or another. She wrote a much ballyhooed, much promoted first novel, Special Topics in Calamity Physics.
Mm-hmm.
I began it. I read about 50 or 60 pages. It wasn't my cup of tea. And so I ended up using it as a book giveaway. I do giveaways every Friday on The Elegant Variation, and that happened to be one of my book giveaways. I think she's gotten a bum rap in a way. I think people are too focused on what she looks like and how much she made for her first book. But I also think there is a danger. This is something I go on about a bit. These very, very young writers selling first novels who just don't really have that much to say.
Yeah.
They haven't lived a sufficiently interesting life yet. And so they may have great verve and skill at the sentence level, but they're not selling something I'm especially interested in. A great contradiction to that is Joshua Ferris's wonderful novel.
Yeah.
Then We Came to the End, which this morning we all just learned is now a well-deserved National Book Award finalist. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and he's a young writer, but he brings a certain depth of some life experience to that novel, and so it resonates. It's real, and it has depth in a way that, from my own reading taste, I didn't find with Special Topics. But there are critics like Laura Miller who absolutely loved the book, so that's where one has to sort of say, different strokes, and that's what makes this a ball game.
You might give Special Topics the Too Clever by Half label?
I probably would, yes.
I did read the book in its entirety myself, and there's a good 300-page book in those 500-something pages.
Yes, and that is often, your criticism there applies to far too many books today.
No.
I think, we've lost our sense of, economy, and we do we're allowed to run on. And I think when you have someone who has some verve and talent and skill, as she clearly does, they're sort of encouraged to perform a bit.
I see.
And they go on longer than they ought to, so.
Real person number 4 is Michiko Kakutani.
The First Lady of Lim.
Lim, yes.
This is one of those horrendously thorny minefields because, although I have no real illusion that she's likely to review my book, it's certainly possible. And so, one doesn't want to slit one's own throat pointlessly. But I'll have to say that she doesn't particularly impress me as a critic. And my problem with her is not that she, yes, she likes to take down the sacred cows. She likes to go after, the big names and take them down a peg. She's just not especially interesting as a thinker or a writer. If you actually start pulling up her reviews and read them at the sentence level, there's a remarkable blandness. It's this sort of innocuous, almost book report-ish kind of feel to far too many of her book reviews, and it really surprises me. That I seldom read a Michiko Kakutani review walking away thinking, God, I must read that book. She doesn't. She's unable to fire me up about the things she loves, nor does she convince me about the things that she dislikes.
And person number 5, I'm going to make this the last person because we got more to talk about, David Foster Wallace.
David Foster Wallace. I am not a fan, as, again, that's one that's fairly well known from people who read my site. I admire his tremendous intelligence. I do not, and I should say, whether it's with Kakutani, with Foster Wallace, with Pessl, with all these people who I have less kind things to say about, it is with their work and them as a writer, and it is not a judgment about them as people, because I do not know them. Foster Wallace is he's a brilliant young man. I mean, he's a remarkable thinker.
Young man, he's older than you are, I think.
Is he? I thought he was old. I'm older than you might think.
He was born in 62, I believe.
Oh, is he? Okay, well, he seems younger than that. I was born in 64. So.
Oh, okay. So he's your elder. So respect your elders.
Yeah,
is my lesson here.
I will respect Professor Wallace in that case. Reading him, it gives me a headache. He's one of the things I am very sensitive to what I perceive as as gimmicks. And to me, the Foster Wallace footnote is such a twitch. It's such a that I read with such irritation. I want to break the superscript key on his keyboard and challenge him to write something without a footnote.
I've seen a few non-footnoted Wallace articles. And, actually, let me ask you this. I'll frame it this way. Are you speaking primarily of his fiction or of his nonfiction or both?
Well, when I speak about footnotes, I'm largely speaking about his nonfiction. I've tried
Yeah.
to read through his essays, and again, I think he's a remarkable thinker, and I think he's a very talented writer. But the way he constructs his thoughts, I just find it's so disruptive, and there's always a little bit of a feeling of look at me. Here's my latest clever footnote, and I find it tiresome. With his fiction, I sort of put him in the Amos camp.
Oh.
There's a cold cleverness to his fiction, and it doesn't really resonate to me. Back to James Wood once famously spoke about reading novels that had nobody identifiably human in them. His criticism about contemporary fiction's failure to fulfill the requirement of the novel as an exploration of character, and I feel that sort of cold breeze coming through the fiction of David Foster Wallace.
Now, I admit to having enjoyed his nonfiction, although like you, I can't really get with his fiction, although kind of like your complaint about the nonfiction, his fiction grinds me down very quickly.
Yes. And his essay on the talk radio host, I think it's called Host.
Yes, John Ziegler.
Was just recently reproduced in one of these collections of Best American Essays.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that piece when it originally, I think it ran in the Atlantic, and I remember looking at this whole the jumble of boxes and the typography and the footnotes, and I just thought, why? You are a brilliant man. You're a strong writer. You have an interesting subject. Why all these calisthenics?
In the original publication in the Atlantic, it was colored too. They were color-coded.
That's right, and that sort of thing. This is purely one reader's prejudice. I have to say, many of the people in my circle, people who I respect and admire, worship him. Think the ground he walks on is sacred. He is not a writer who writes the kind of things I'm interested in. But I would not say he's terrible. He's overrated. He's horrible. He's we don't quite speak the same language.
You can't get with what he's doing.
And the thing that surprises me is he once wrote beautifully on sort of the corrosive power of irony and how irony is really undermining. And yet it seems to me that he's failed to heed his own lessons. He's got that sort of...
Ironist, heal thyself?
Yes. He's got this weird distrust of whether it's sentiment or emotion or anything that is, true, frankly. And I see him sort of running scared from that, and I would love to see him engage with that. So,
let's move on to your novel, Harry Revised. Now, it's about, as I understand it, a widower who is reinventing himself, and that's pretty much all I know. So, if you want to give a little verbal trailer...
Sure. My agent teases me because I should be better at this than I am, and he keeps reminding me I need to get good at it.
Here's practice.
But yes, it is a black comedy, and it's a story about a man who is seeking to reinvent himself in the wake of the death of his wife. What's happened is, as we meet him at the beginning of the story, his wife has recently died from, we learn, plastic surgery. And as a result of that decision, he is sort of catching some residual blame. He's perceived as perhaps, was he the reason? Was it something he did that drove her to this? And he doesn't want to be thought of badly. And he decides he's going to try to reinvent himself. And he does so by sort of patterning himself after Edmond Dantes, the Count of Monte Cristo, who he is much taken with and found, somebody who was wrongly accused and then went on to sort of recreate himself. And as he does this, he's doing it within the framework of being attracted to this young waitress in a coffee shop, and he sort of gets into these strange misadventures with her. But what's really happening here is he's trying to avoid his grief. He's going through all of these bizarre and one hopes funny machinations, putting himself through all these, twisting himself into all these knots, really to just not confront the fact of what he's lost and the fact of the truth of his marriage, which was not as good as he would like to remember it.
He's ignoring many elephants in the room simultaneously.
Oh, and the elephants are crushing him by the end of the book.
Oh, dear.
Yes.
So what made Harry Revised the novel that was not a 30-page false start?
That's a good... Boy, you've done your homework. You've been reading my site. I think it was that it had a theme that really resonated with me. What Harry is really about, at the thematic level, is about the question of change. How do people change? What does it mean to change? What does it mean to decide you're no longer the person who you were? You need to be somebody different. You want to be somebody different. How does that happen? And you know, I've struggled with some of those questions in real life, and so I had at least some opinions that I thought might be valid. But as is always the way with a novel, I just read something wonderful today in the Paris Review, the new volume of the Paris Review interviews, where Toni Morrison said that when you write a novel, and I'm paraphrasing her, if you merely are trying to state a point of view or an idea, that's not a novel. That is a tract. A novel is where you say, I think it's this, but I could be wrong, and perhaps, in fact, it's this. And what I found as I wrote Harry is, and he came to life for me, was that question of how he changed and what the change would mean to him did take on a life of its own, and he took me into some unexpected places, and relationships within the book that I thought were secondary ended up really becoming primary, and it was a great process of discovery. So
I'm just going to put this out there. Has blogging, your experience doing all this blogging, brought anything to your fiction writing? Or are they separate domains?
Well, the only thing that it's brought, I think, is the discipline of writing something every day. So paying attention to my words at the sentence level, that sort of thing is important. I think that has been very helpful. You know, every day churning out these sentences, looking at them, making sure they're clean, they're economical, they make sense, and I think that came over. But beyond that, yeah, there is a wall, I think, of sorts between the book and the blog. Somebody, one of my early readers, who's a dear friend, said she loved finding in the book, she loved finding the trademark Mark Sarvas humor. Which sort of surprised me because I didn't really know there was such a thing.
Oh, news to you, huh?
And I guess people, you know, who like the blog and who like the sensibility of the blog will find that a similar sensibility worldview in the book. I suppose that's unavoidable because we take that with us wherever we go, whatever work that we do. But really, I do view them as fairly separate animals, and I think it's telling if you look through the archives of the blog. You can tell the times I was busiest at the novel because that's when there's the least activity on the blog.
So you publish on both a blog and you publish on newsprint as well. You review novels and now you're writing them. Are you feeling like some kind of a double agent at this point?
That's an excellent question. It is increasingly uncomfortable.
Oh.
It's increasingly difficult because I know people I'm writing about now. You know, one of the things that really and I don't know if you were planning to ask me about this or not. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. I've also had a few high-profile feuds over time. But that's really been born, the earliest ones especially, were really born of the fact that I honestly didn't believe anyone was reading. I couldn't believe that people would really pay attention and what I had to say. And suddenly, I became aware that my words do have weight. And so now, today, you know, I don't want to be the believer from the perspective of I don't want to be simply the guy who says nice things all the time.
Yeah.
I do reserve the right to be critical and to, you know, sort of knock the wind out of somebody who I think has courted that and has sort of puffed themselves up. But I do feel myself increasingly more careful about what I say, and frankly, there's a likelihood that I'm going to meet these people who I criticize at some point. Our paths are likely to cross.
Yes,
and
yes.
One certainly doesn't want a Colson Whitehead Richard Ford moment. Although perhaps those are a little bit unavoidable. I just wrote, as I mentioned, that review for Truth Dig, which I mentioned earlier.
Sure.
And it's a negative review. And it's a negative review of somebody who also lives here in Los Angeles, and I think is actually bigger than me.
Oh,
so,
boy.
You know, I've got this slight fear that I'm going to have this angry writer sort of showing up on my doorstep and, you know, demanding accountability. And that stuff, it does start toying on you. You know, you asked me a question about the Los Angeles Times book review. And to be perfectly candid, as I was answering it in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but think about, you know, they will undoubtedly, you know, review my book. And so
you thought of Dave Hewlin coming to your door, knocking and kind of frowning in the door peephole, and
says, "I'm going to fix you now." You know, Dave's a good guy. I mean, there are other people on his staff, perhaps I'm more worried about than David. But that question, it does inform you, and it's disturbing, and it's also a little disappointing because as a blogger, you know, you do pride yourself on your freedom and your independence. And when you start to feel that curtailed, there have been one or two moments where I've had to ask myself, should I really continue this blog? Am I still in a position to be as honest, you know, accountable? Because my readers do expect that. The minute they feel I'm pulling my punches or, you know, sugarcoating things or not saying things, either to protect, you know, my own self-interest or to protect the feelings of someone with whom I have a shared interest, I'm going to very deservedly lose my readers.
Mark Sarvas, thanks so much for coming on the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself.
Great, good to have you on, and hopefully we'll have you on again when Harry Revised hits the shelves, huh?
I would love to. I'd love to come back. Thank you.
Read Mark Sarvas' blog, The Elegant Variation, at www.elegvar.com. All of the Marketplace of Ideas music is produced by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, benalthouse.com. That's BenAlthouse. He's also been known to go under the names Ice Ben and DJ Concept. Check out his grooves on benalthouse.com. Be sure to check out our website, www.colinmarshallradio.com/marketplace. All feedback, please direct to colin@colinmarshallradio.com. And we hope to see you soon on the next episode of the Marketplace of Ideas.